Shelley, Sarah, Laura, hello, how are you doing?
Good.
Uh,
Very well.
Today we're talking about no less than two projects, Memories of Fiction and Living Libraries. And we start our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves. So would you mind doing that and then telling us a little bit about where you sit in relation to those two projects, please? Shelley, do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. So I'm Shelley Trower. I'm Professor of English Literature at Roehampton, and there's been these two projects. The first was Memories of Fiction. This was an oral history project that started in 2014 and officially finished in 2018. It was AHRC funded, but it's still going on. I've got an article out soon. Memories of Fiction was an oral history project about people's memories of fiction, what they remember, about books they've read, what they forget as well, which is an absolutely huge amount. So my article that I'm about to get published is called Forgetting Fiction, because again and again and again, we kind of pushed people, what do you remember about that book that you loved? And like, well, not very much in many cases. So I became really fascinated with forgetting as well. But a major strand of that was libraries as well. So the people we interviewed were members of book groups based in libraries. And then again and again, they kept talking about how important libraries were to them in different ways. So then the next project is Living Libraries, which is a follow-on project from that.
And the AHRC, I should say, that's the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who are one of the major funders of arts research projects in the UK. So do you want to tell us quickly about Living Libraries as an intro, and then we'll move on to our other contributors?
Again, it's very much an oral history project. So the first part of it, we've gone interviewing people across England. So where Memories of Fiction was very South London focused, it was based in the Wandsworth borough. Sarah's disappeared. She'll be back, I'm sure. Living Libraries became a national project. So we've got Newcastle, Chester, Peterborough, London again, and Cornwall, Falmouth in Cornwall. And we've interviewed people in all those different libraries, people that both work there and who use those libraries.
I think to have safe spaces where people can go and people can discuss and talk and not be afraid about what they have to say. Places for people to come together. That's going to be so important, isn't it, going forward?
And it's really about how libraries have changed in different ways over particularly the last 10 years. So we hear a lot about libraries and the cuts and the loss of libraries and all of that. But also, of course, there's computers now in libraries. There's loads of different activities. I'm endlessly astonished at what goes on in libraries. Like, did I hear wrestling? No, that's you, Andy, isn't it? But I think there might be wrestling.
Oh, no, you're right. Yeah. Merton Library hosts Soul Wrestling. Yeah. In Wimbledon.
And music, knitting, like just everything really goes on in libraries now.
Otters.
So libraries changed so much. Sorry, Laura?
Otters. Yeah, they're quite smelly, I'm told.
Otters in libraries. Okay. We've been talking about all these changes and also some interviews with national library figures like the CEO of the Chartered Institute for Librarians and Information Professionals, Libraries Connected president, and people like that as well, to try and get a national picture of libraries and how they're changing in different ways in different regions.
National questions that impact individuals and the communities are absolutely happening here, yeah. Conversations about who we are, where else are they happening? Private WhatsApp groups. Let's talk about who we are and why we are. Debate our heritage. That's what libraries should be doing.
That was the first 6 months anyway, the oral history.
Okay, and whereas Memories of Fiction was a project in the past, you're now describing a project that's just started, right? You're only 6 months in. I guess we should clarify that.
Well, we're coming to the end now, but that was until the pandemic, really. So luckily, we'd done all that. We'd gone around and interviewed people before that hit.
But I just hope libraries are here to stay for the future, and I hope they're seen as important. I think that's all I would say. I'd hope the politicians would recognise the place that we have for the future.
We've got Sarah back. That's excellent. Or at least we've got a picture of Sarah back. Hopefully Sarah's
no. She was very still.
Laura, do you want to introduce yourself? And then if Sarah's not back in time, I shall ventriloquize or something.
Should we pause it at all, Andy? Or is...
Yeah, should we start again? so hoping not to do that, but let's do that. Hang on. What a shame. Welcome back, folks. We had a bit of a technical blip, but we think we are back. And we just heard from Shelley about her relationship with the two projects. Laura, would you mind introducing yourself?
So I am a theatre maker, very broadly speaking. So I am a director, producer, but the work that I do tends to be very collaborative and very design focused. And so the projects that I've done here, Memories and Fiction and The Living Library, have both been more live arts or sort of interactive installations end of things, but basically around taking the research and having a creative response to it that in some way engages the general public with what's going on in the material.
Great, fantastic, thank you. I can't wait to hear more about that. Finally, Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Sarah Pike. I'm the Impact and Engagement Officer on the Living Libraries project. So my role in the project has been carrying out lots of the oral histories and then doing some of the analysis work about our findings, making recommendations, and thinking about how we can share what we've done in creating that archive with a kind of wider public, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about. And I've come to the project partly through my PhD, which looked at memories of reading in childhood and adolescence, particularly queer adults. And libraries really started to play quite an important role in the memories that people were sharing with me. But that PhD itself was part of the bigger Memories of Fiction project. So both Shelley and I really were starting to get interested in public libraries from slightly different angles, but it seemed to align really nicely when the idea of living libraries was born, really.
Great, thank you. And I was lucky enough to read that PhD, and it's fantastic. I always want to unpack that jargony word impact, which I always think sounds weirdly threatening and bizarre. It's kind of an academic term for taking research a little bit, as Laura was saying earlier, taking research and doing something with it in a non-academic context. So if it's okay to stand back then from the two projects that you've introduced, it sounds like Memories of Fiction was thinking about traditional uses of libraries in terms of book clubs. So people doing, terribly unexpected things like reading in a library in a not just a London context, but a predominantly southeastern context, and that Living Libraries has shifted that to thinking at a national level, but also thinking about libraries as kind of multifunctional spaces. Is that right? And do you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, Memories of Fiction for me did highlight libraries as physical spaces where people go. So there are the books, and that's absolutely core to a lot of what libraries do. But yeah, just they're study spaces, they're spaces where you can explore and discover, and they're safe spaces. And actually it's the study spaces and the focus. They're spaces where you can focus that's come to the fore for me recently with the pandemic, because lots of our students were saying they missed the library because of the resources, but also because that's where they used to go and focus. And I had no idea that our students, that's really what the library was massively good for, was somewhere to go, not get distracted, sit down and focus on those books. But yeah, I would agree that Memories of Fiction was more focused around the libraries being places where you have books, where you study books and all of that. And Living Libraries, yeah, has really brought to attention how much more libraries really do. Yeah, would you agree with that, Sarah?
I think a really interesting thing about public libraries is that most people feel that they know what a library is and does, and most people have good memories of libraries from childhood and would agree really that a library is a good thing and must be preserved, even if they never use their own public library. And I think something that was really interesting in this project is actually going to libraries in the last part of 2019 and early 2020 and finding out what they're really like, what are they really doing, how different they are, how libraries are about books and reading and study and information, but they're also places where some of the most vulnerable and marginalised people go. They're free civic spaces. They're places that people go for community. There's all kinds of social events happening in libraries. There's often this idea that a library is a place of silence and quiet, and nothing could be further from the truth in 2020. So I think my interest in libraries and my kind of personal feeling about libraries was, like many people, rooted in this sort of quite nostalgic childhood idea and good memories of being a reader in adolescence and young adulthood. So it's really exciting to go into them and find out the enormous breadth of important work that they're doing across the country, really.
Yeah, was it Anthony Hopkins maybe that was saying that they did a survey? Would that have been in Merton? That was saying that that people's kind of the reputation of the library was higher amongst people. Like it was just as high amongst people that didn't actually go to the library. Like they loved it, but they just never. But they still loved it, and they didn't want it to go. It's like people think it's a good thing, even if
Exactly.
yeah, and don't perhaps know at all what goes on inside.
It plays in a really interesting way, I think, to kind of library campaigning discourse. There was an article by Edmund Duval, who in The Guardian, he had a little exhibition about libraries and migration. But again, pushing this idea that libraries are important because there are places where children can go to find silence and quiet and be alone with books, which is a really important role of a library. But there's also so much important social work that is happening in libraries, so much that is about gaps in government services that are actually being met by libraries all the time, and as funding drops in certain areas, it's being met by ever harder working public library staff. And I think that is the story of libraries that this project has really uncovered, and it's a really important one to tell. I think about Baha Siddiq in Collier's Wood Library, security guard, who was just saying, you know, if the government wants to know what's happening in the country, come to the library.
Everyone here has their own story, have their own things that you can just learn from it. So if, for example, the government sends someone to local libraries just to listen to people, it will be more education for politicians and for everyone who wanted to know what the communities need and what the community is all about.
If you want to know what's happening in the community, come here and just look at people, and you'll see, well, there's people in here for 8 hours a day because it's warm and it's free, and they can sit here and they don't have
any food while they're here.
Yeah.
And they're wearing sandals when it's raining, and it's like, things are happening.
I'm now dreaming of the government going to libraries to get to know its populace. That sounds like an amazing and very sensible thing.
Yeah,
I think there are MPs that have that already do that and recognise that and have like surgeries in libraries. I think Carol Stamps says that. Was Jo Cox having a surgery at the library?
She was, yeah.
And she was killed, yeah.
I think another important point to make about libraries is that the kind of political map is so mixed. Libraries are protected under the 1964 Act. They are a statutory service, they do have to be funded, but local authorities make those decisions and they do it so differently. Luke, when he council, he's in the part of the council which is also talking about the bins and those kinds of services. Whereas Carol Stump was saying in Kirklees, it's brilliant because she's sitting around the table with public health. So they're really part of the public health conversation and the child protection conversation, and they're able to be seen as playing that role by other parts of the council. But there's just it just doesn't seem very joined up. There seems to be a very kind of messy picture nationwide.
Okay, so where libraries sit in council funding, where they're structured, where they're organised, is really important. And you were talking about the differences between libraries, and we've already had, what have we had? Knitting, otters and wrestling. I feel like those things are self-evidently different. But could you tell us a bit more about some of those differences which are emerging from the work?
Yeah, well, there was Falmouth, but like far southwest up to Newcastle up that way. And yeah, I did most of the interviews in Falmouth actually, and Sarah did all the interviews in Newcastle. So I'd be interested to hear what Sarah thinks actually in the contrast there. But in Falmouth, we chose it partly because it had combined with an art gallery, and that was one of the reasons. So there's a lot of exchange between the art gallery and the library. So they have pictures in the library from the gallery, for example, and they host different events and things. But yeah, it's that, well, I think Newcastle is doing much more with the council and things. I'd be interested to hear more about the Newcastle one, Sarah. Is Sarah frozen?
Yeah. Well, so I wonder, I think one of the things that was that somebody was talking about was the way that that the library used to be a service that's like, this is what the library does, and if you want to do that, come to the library. And now the libraries are more, what does the community need, and how can the library provide that for these particular cohorts of people? And so I think that probably that goes across all of the 5 libraries. And maybe has those differences. Like Falmouth is quite arty, it's got loads of tourists, you know, it's maybe quite transient. And Newcastle libraries are really like in a city library, it's like a real regional hub. And then Peterborough has got, you know, a big sort of different waves of immigrant communities that have become part of the population. It's got problems with literacy. And you know, that like all those really specific factors about what's going on in that community, I think have made them quite different in their buildings and in their offer and so yeah, but I think all of them, it seems to come out of that idea of like, well, what is it that this community needs? And even though like it's a messy picture, like Sarah was saying before, part of the reason maybe why it's not tighter is that it's really hard to write what a library should be when actually it's trying to respond so directly to so many different factors. I don't know if you heard any of that, Sarah.
And there's also huge differences in funding. So somewhere like Story House in Chester is hugely well funded. It's just a fantastic library with a huge amount to offer. And others have really struggled, are losing staff all the time. Opening hours are really short, and obviously some close, well, lots have closed. So yeah, different councils and different levels of funding make a massive difference to what libraries can be.
It's funny because when we were, so like really early when me and the 2 designers, so Lucy Harrison and Ellie Slade, we kind of came together to be like, what bits do we want to focus on? Because there's so much that everybody talks about. There's like hours and hours and hours and hours of interviews. And when we were talking about the cuts, because that the austerity does really run through it all, and we were saying, you know, on the one hand, we don't want to just focus on that, and maybe it is a bit of a stereotype now that libraries are closing, and that's not the real or the full story. And yet to not talk about that does an injustice to all the libraries that have closed and all of the staff that are currently and have been under huge amounts of pressure and have gone through redundancy processes and something. It's a difficult story, I think, to kind of pull together as a country because it is so diverse.
Yeah. Do you mind if we talk about the specifics of this work then? And particularly the kind of the route from the oral histories which Sarah and Shelley are pursuing, and then the creative responses that Laura is working with. Do the people you're speaking to for the oral histories, I presume that they know that this work may then be adapted, taken up in creative work, and I wonder if that affects it, for example. And I'm super interested in this because I spent all of my life working on people who are irretrievably dead by centuries, and if I started having oral histories with them, it would be horrifying, probably for both sides, but certainly for me. But at the same time, you're also making the 21st century library sound a lot like a 16th century playhouse, which is also a multifunctional space, which does a lot more than just plays and is a sort of community, a kind of community centre in lots of ways. But yeah, do you mind telling us a bit about the process of doing oral history, and then what that then does to Laura's work and what Laura does to that work?
Yeah, well, to start with, that people we interview do know that we will do things with that interview. So just, part of the fully informed consent process is to explain what our plans are. Though there were some changes, because we were going to give talks in libraries in March and April and May, and we had the exhibition plan that Laura was going to do and all of this. So yeah, we do explain that to some extent anything can happen to these interviews, and people can say, oh, well, I'd rather not have it used in some ways and other ways. So yeah, we make sure that people are informed about what's going to happen. And there were going to be these exhibitions, so although we've moved it online, I don't think it's, in some ways, it's that far away from our intentions. So that's sort of the ethics side of it. But did you have any thoughts, Sarah, about?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to say is oral history is really interesting because you can explain all of that, and we do before the interview starts. And we also explained, well, this interview is going into a new archive that will be created at National Life Stories at the British Library, and it's the first archive of oral histories about public libraries, and that's kind of exciting, and people like to think, oh, I'm leaving my voice for posterity and all of that. So in a way, there's sort of performance elements built in a sense, because you're accepting the idea as a participant that you're contributing to something bigger, and that people will be able to come and listen to your voice, hopefully, in years to come. But as with any performance, I guess, it's all contingent, and you don't really know what people are going to say, and people themselves don't know what they're going to say during the interview. So that's something else to take on board. And I always like to say to people before we get started, this is an oral history interview, and part of what we do is talk about your life and early memories, and things might come up that you weren't expecting. We can always cut any of that stuff out if you like. And people do remember things, or things come to mind that they weren't expecting to say. I spoke to a woman called Linda at Story House in Chester, and she remembered this whole story about her old maths teacher coming to the house with a book that she'd said she'd wanted, and she'd never thought of that for however many years. The other thing that I think is interesting about working with oral histories is, and this is something I'd like to talk to Laura about in this conversation, hopefully, is that as the person who's done a lot of the interviews and listened to them and analysed them, you've kind of been part of this incredible process of hearing all of this material, which is live and created in the moment of that interview, and then thinking, how do I digest this, and how do I make this accessible to somebody else? Because as Laura was saying, there are hours and hours and hours of audio to listen to. And I think you do get a sense as the researcher listening to all of that you've been through this incredible experience, but how do you then communicate that to other people? And that's why working with a creative team like Laura's team has been so good for this project, and there's so much scope. We could do so much more if we had more time. Because it's one thing to take small clips of the oral histories and share them on the website, which we've been able to do. That's great. People will also be able to access the archive online, which is great. But there's so much rich material there. Yeah, maybe Laura wants to add.
And I think it's really interesting, and it's also quite frustrating, because when you have invested into listening all of those, because you know there's something nice about having that person right in front of you and going to the different libraries, I imagine, and kind of participating in it, both of you. But for me it's just like I'm just sitting in my room just for like weeks on end listening to other people talking, and you know it's like a tsunami that kind of just really comes over you, and you come out of it and you do feel, I feel so like I have got all this knowledge that I didn't have before, but it's a really unwieldy format. It takes a long time to listen to audio, especially, you know, you can't skim audio in the way that you would skim a paper. So the idea of trying to transfer that sense of what you heard to somebody else is it's really, it's like the fun bit is trying to do it, obviously, but like it's been the big question that I've been tackling. So you know, some people might listen to the entire archive in the British library at some point if they're like super keen and into public libraries, but basically no one's going to hear that. So what is it that you do want to, or how do you, I guess it's like the indexing thing, you know, like how do you make it as accessible as possible to find those bits, those kind of tags, so that somebody could take it on more if they want to, or that you can kind of summarize it in some form to get, it's that proper fiction thing, right? Like you're not, it's a lie that tells the truth, you know, it's how can you make something new out of it, but that is still honest enough, faithful enough to the original material, and that you can represent what is hours and hours and hours in like 2 minutes.
You have to be extremely selective, don't you? And you're always aware of how much you've missed out. And yeah.
And so I read a lot of stuff around different kinds of verbatim theatre beforehand, because obviously it's a well-established thing that you would take actual people's words and written text and use that to create theatre. So that's like an established format. And we looked at different things like, I've forgotten what it's called, but there's a really interesting woman that kind of pioneered a theatre practice where you have the person's audio played directly into your ear as the performer, so that you're speaking the text as they spoke it, kind of in real time. And it's supposed to provide another way of being authentic to the material. I mean, it's still edited and chosen, and it's still in a theatrical environment. So there's still choices that have been made. But yeah, like how much you change. We also did things like for Memories of Fiction, we tried writing, like giving writers or a writer like a true story and asking them to fictionalize it to see if maybe going another step would somehow find a different essence of it. But I think in general we came back to the idea of like we would edit stuff down, but that we would not add things that were not already in the material. That's kind of the approach that we took. So sometimes it's about editing one person's story. In Memories of Fiction, you know, we had a monologue that people listened to in the dark. So you were just hearing their words. So it was one interview. In fact, no, it was two that we cut together, and you just hear two different lives juxtaposed. But sometimes it was like a theme. So you'd pull out 6 people's different views on one thing, and you'd play them next to each other like a collage. And then, yeah, I think in the living libraries, we've done something similar, which is it's an argument. It's, you know, it's kind of for me, it's got like an intro and then some subsections and a conclusion argument. But they're all different bits that I've pulled from different people's interviews. So it's definitely my view. It's definitely got like a POV. But I've tried to I've tried to still show a range of views within it. I don't know, I only made it. What do you think, Shelley or Andy? I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it yet. I'm sort of more interested in how it comes across rather than what I was trying to do.
Well, yeah, I do like the way the themes are sort of juxtaposed, because people might talk about, oh, when I used to go to the library, they were so quiet and it was so intimidating, and then you say you've got the silence of libraries, and then how noisy they are now. There's so many different ways you can think about libraries and what people have said about them and group them and put them together. And yeah, like you say, you found one path through. And I love the different voices as well, the sort of diversity of voices that come across. I wondered whether to play a clip briefly. We've got a 1.5 minute clip. Shall I try and play it on my?
Well, we can insert that into the film.
Okay.
Let me just hit pause for a second. So welcome back, guys. We've had a very exciting film so far where we've had various technical challenges, but we are all back. We've changed our outfits because we're now speaking on a different day entirely, and we're picking up the rest of the conversation. So as we paused for non-comic effects, Laura, you were about to tell us about the differences in the two projects and the kinds of material that they generated in their oral histories. So would you mind telling us a bit about that?
Yeah, and I don't know if I've spoken to you guys about this, so I'd be interested to hear what you think about it. But I was really aware when I was trawling through, just doing like a full pass of listening to everything all in one go, of the libraries. It was interesting that people were not as emotional in their talk, in their conversation, as they were in Memories of Fiction. And it was really noticeable, like how emotional people were in Memories of Fiction, like the way that fiction, and I guess remembering something that is innately quite personal or quite an intimate activity, generated all these amazing, sometimes quite harrowing stories from people at really key times in their lives. Whereas I think that libraries was is a step between the reading and the experience. So people were talking much more still positive about libraries, but I felt like the interviews felt more academic and just like a bit more restrained, maybe also because we had more staff members rather than only users, and that was a real difference for me in terms of trying to make something creative, because usually you would look for the narrative, you'd look for the story, the anecdote that goes with it, and that's the thing that you'd use to kind of bring the audience in, is what's going to happen next, or like how has this person been changed, whereas they were much more like this is what it is and this is what I think. Do you guys notice that difference?
Until you mentioned it, I hadn't. But have you got any examples, Laura, like you said, with harrowing stories and things in the first project?
I mean, I think that also it was interesting because I think that the people that were LGBTQ that really like said that libraries had saved them, or like were a real important place of escape, and I think salvation, somebody said. I think the fact that maybe if you are going through a time that is difficult, then that means that when you remember it kind of, you can still hear the sort of like the heightened experience in people's voices. Like I've forgotten who it was, maybe it was Alice, that was talking about being at boarding school and saying just like how much of an escape it was to literally feel like you genuinely did need to kind of hide and not be in your environment and to escape into a book. And that was really sort of compelling. Whereas a librarian talking about how important it is for other people to have that is never going to have the same punch as hearing it. It's almost like Memories of Fiction were first-hand accounts, and Living Libraries is all second-hand accounts, because it's people, for example, it would be something that would be more dramatic, if you like, just from like a ulterior kind of dramatist's point of view might be a story of somebody coming in that, you know, was really angry and having a go at the librarian staff, and how the librarian themselves had to deal with that, and then actually it turning out that, well, yeah, they're angry because their electricity has been cut off and they don't have any money and they can't get hold of the council, and they, you know, and the way that the librarian then goes through the process of responding, like, oh, this isn't just a horrible person that's here to make my day awful, like they're in need, and this is how we can help them and sort them out. But there's kind of a different dynamic about kind of hearing it from the user's point of view and then the more professional point of view.
I think that's a really, really important point, and I think it's also to do with the position that as the researcher or as the interviewer we are asking people to inhabit when we interview them. So in Memories of Fiction, the whole focus really was about people thinking back through their childhood and adolescent memories and through their adulthood and narrating their life story and their very personal subjective relationship to books and reading. And in the Libraries project, although we are asking people to talk about their memories in often very similar ways, they're also there in their professional roles. They're there to represent their own library and also what they think being a library worker is, and the various kind of institutional persona that they might need to take on to perform that role of being a good library staff member. So I think all of that is overlaid in interviews, but I do think it's a really important point, and I was very pleased and excited always when you could kind of break through some of those more formal ways of expressing what a libraryism does to the more personal stories. One that really sticks out is Martin Harris from Chester, talking about his experience of Storyhouse as a safe place for him as an older gay man, and how all of his life he's been looking for safe spaces and places where he is accepted for who he is, and he finally feels that he's found that in Storyhouse, and that was really moving, I thought.
Yeah, comparing, you know, what the library would have been like in his day and how basically there wouldn't have been things there, and now he like turns the books onto display so that if somebody comes along that they'll have that he didn't. He
was particularly talking about at Storyhouse they have a section, it's called Shelf Help, and it's for young people who are maybe looking for books that might help them deal with certain kind of personal issues or things they might not want to talk to adults in their life about. And he says if there are any books in there about being queer, he will turn them around specifically because he hopes that there's a young queer person out there who's looking for that material.
I think it's really interesting as well, like for somebody that was maybe looking to do oral histories to think about what that is like. So I know that I come from a drama point of view, but actually just from an oral history historian kind of record of the ages point of view, those anecdotes and those like really personal things that you say you might have to like sometimes break through the professional, not facade, but kind of mask, they are the things that really stay with you. And so you might, if you were making a list of questions, you might not think immediately that it would be important to ask personal stuff, but there's something about, yeah, the hat that you're wearing when you're talking to the interviewer and the relationship that gets built in the room. And it's so amazing, like, you know, just to hear the little dynamics between the interviewer and the interviewee and what impact that must have on what they feel willing to share as well. And you were saying you really noticed that sometimes you, like one person said that they felt that you were really posh. Is that right?
Yes, only one person in all of the interviews afterwards said, oh, you know, because our final question is always, how did you find that process of being interviewed? And one person said, I really noticed the difference between my voice and your voice. And I thought that was really interesting. And also, didn't exactly surprise me with that particular interviewee, because she was the only person that requested anonymity. And there were lots of things about that interview where I knew that she was very conscious of what it meant to go on the record, how far she wanted to be on the record. She was happy for her voice to be recorded and to contribute to the archive and to put her point across, but she did have reservations about talking very frankly and openly about her employer, quite rightly and understandably. But it really, her response showed me that it's not just the researcher and the interviewer who is paying attention in that sense, in terms of what are the dynamics here, but the interviewee is also extremely conscious of what those dynamics are. And I mean, you theoretically know this as an interviewer, that part of what is happening is you're building a particular relationship, and that person may tell you certain things that they might not tell a different interviewer, but to have it very clearly explained by that particular interviewee was a really a good moment, actually.
This is fascinating, and I'm wondering if we might segue now to talking about the outputs of the project. But I'd like to retain the conversation we've just had as we go. I'm particularly interested to hear about how some of the things you've just been talking about, how they then in turn impact and influence Laura's work. So how Laura's work responds to these differences in these two pools. But Shelley, would you mind talking us through the outputs of the project?
Sure, yeah. So we were going to do the talks and all that in libraries, and then COVID-19 happened. So we rapidly rethought the project, and the first major change was the website. We had no plans to do a website, and we now have a website which Sarah designed, which I think is fabulous. And I don't think there's been any loss. There's just been change. We've evolved wonderfully, I think. So it's a really lovely website, and there's all different resources on that. So some of the things haven't changed. We were still going to do before a policy pack, and now that's obviously on the website. We're not posting it in quite the same way or giving it out at talks and things, but yeah, it's very available and we can email that and everything. And Sarah could say more about that, I think, because she put that together. And then there's sort of sound pieces that Laura and her team, Ellie Slade, Lucy Harrison put together, and there's the virtual library, which I think is also really exciting. It's the first of its kind. So yeah, I think it's been really exciting to put a positive spin on the whole coronavirus thing. So yeah, and the policy pack, yeah, do you want to say a bit more about that, Sarah?
Sure, yeah. So this was built into the project from the start with the idea that from the archive that we would assemble of people talking about public libraries, their experiences, the changes that have gone on in them, we would be able to make some recommendations for the future of public libraries. And as we analysed the material, we found that there were really 4 themes that were coming out very strongly. So why libraries are important for health and well-being, why they're such important community spaces, libraries as providers of trusted information, particularly given the current climate of disinformation and misinformation and fake news. And lastly, well, we could frame it as libraries and crisis. We were really thinking about the environment when we wrote it, and how libraries play a role in helping to tackle climate change. In their very model, they're environmentally friendly because they're a kind of recycling model for books, as one of our interviewees put it really well. But also how libraries respond in moments of crisis, both by providing that information that people need, and also in much more practical ways. So to link it to climate change, when Storm Ciara happened earlier this year, there were librarians who were asked to wear their wellies to work in case they might be helping people in flooded areas. But with COVID-19, we've also seen libraries respond in extremely practical and hands-on ways, whether that's ringing vulnerable people in their communities or even being redeployed to other roles in their communities. I mean, librarians have been working in morgues, or library workers have been working in morgues during this time, and a whole range of responses. They've been using their 3D printers to make PPE, things like that. Anyway, so our policy pack is really a kind of qualitative companion to a lot of other research that has been done on libraries. So it's the first kind of intervention that uses oral histories and uses some of those personal stories to make its case. There's lots of really excellent statistics and facts about libraries showing why they're so important to helping government meet many of its most pressing points on its policy agenda. But this hopefully does it through the real words and real life experiences of people, which, as we've kind of touched on, are often the things that most stay with you, most change your mind, most affect people. And the idea is that it was something quite small, friendly, easy to read, easy to look at, that library workers and decision makers can use, and that people can use to advocate for why libraries are so important.
It sounds fantastic, thank you. Shelley and Laura and Sarah, do you want to tell us how that then intersects with the creative work that's happening? Maybe we should start with Laura on that question, if that's all right.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it obviously the idea was that we would be interacting with people that were in their library. So something that I think came through or was talked about quite early for us was the idea that people tend to think they know what a library is and what it does, and tend to be really surprised that it's really not that, or not just that. And that lots of people have big gaps in their library use. So you go to the library a lot as a child because your parents take you, or your school takes you, or whatever. You maybe use it when you're studying, and then you get this massive drop off, either because you start work or you'll go to university and they've got their own library, and then you sort of don't need it, or you don't have time until something kickstarts your usage again. So you move to a new area. You are unemployed and need help with services, or you have a kid and you become the parent that's taking the next generation. And then when you retire, suddenly you have more time, you're wanting to use your brain, and there's a big uptick again. So the idea was that we would be sort of sharing with people that were walking through the library, like, these are the things that are going on, and what is your view on this? And yes, we've interviewed X number of people, but what does that mean to you? And yeah, so it was disseminating it in that way. And now the libraries are closed, so it's definitely had to have a different vibe. And a different audience anyway. So we decided that because we couldn't physically be in libraries and be doing touch-based installations, definitely not COVID-proof in any way, like headphones, and no, not even in the medium term. So we looked online, and like Shelley and Sarah were saying, we have a website, and that's fab. I'm glad that we did that anyway now. But the thing that I was keen on was that so the difference between maybe an ordinary member of the public and somebody that's propelled to come and look because they're an academic or they're doing some policy work is that it needs to have just be fun, be sort of entertaining or diverting in some way. And the way that we'd come to it was this idea of it being interactive and using your senses. So we were going to have like smells to smell, and like stamps so that you could have a go, because that is basically what came through the interviews, is that the thing that everyone misses is the being able to stamp your book, even though that was years ago. And when we did Memories of Fiction and we did have a stamper, it was the place that everyone stayed at for the longest time, and we just had with a table just completely filled with people's stamps. But we still wanted to keep a sense of those sort of fun interactive things. So what we've tried to do, and I think have done, is to create a virtual, imagined, sort of abstracted library that functions as an exhibition or installation space. So you physically move through the space as a computer character, and then you have to sort of be in certain places to trigger bits of the interviews, and they are themed and sort of collaged together, so that you're not hearing whole stories of somebody, but that you're just hearing little snippets. And I guess if you were a real kind of hardcore fan, you could also then go back to the archive and do the thing in full, but it's sort of more to give an impressionistic version of what people said, and then also to prompt them to contribute, to join the conversation by sharing their own story with us, which you can either do on our website or through this virtual world. So yeah, it's a completely different format, which we would probably never have chosen because it's just not my background at all. And yet I think possibly there's something quite exciting about, there's a lot of conversations in libraries about audience and reach, and how you get to these pockets of people, how you reach younger people, which again, libraries are really diverse, and some libraries like Chester have like fabulous young people's programs. But I think doing it online in a gamified form means that some of the people that we would have thought would say have come to the public talks might be challenged and interested to like dip their foot in the water of trying out an online very simple game type thing. And people that come from that world that are already on this online platform that we've used called Sciencebase might dip their toe in the water of an exhibition about libraries. We've got a festival of work that some of the people that have worked on the project are submitting it to, and their students. We haven't had this festival yet, but we've got hopefully a whole cohort of students that are going to come and take a look around, and they would never have found their way, I presume, all these sort of 16 to 20-year-olds. So yeah, it's interesting, but it's also, this is what libraries are doing all the time. You know, it's like there are coding groups, and there are this, and there's this, there's raves going on in libraries in Toronto, and like libraries are really good at responding and pivoting to these things, these innovations. So it feels a little bit in keeping. Would you agree, guys?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very responsive, aren't they, libraries, to people and their different needs and interests.
And the fact that this is digital, I think, is really key as well, because libraries are so good at digital inclusion. They're so good at providing access to computers and printing, and help with people putting their CVs in Word, and coding, and the whole range of kind of digital activities. But when you talk to library workers and library users, it's still often seen as two separate strands that are offered by public libraries, the digital and the books. Whereas what I think is so nice about this is it's bringing those two things together in a way, because it's people's memories of libraries. There's lots of talk about books and bookish things, but experienced digitally. And I suppose also it ties into the fact that libraries' digital offer has been so successful during this time of lockdown, in that all kinds of things have pivoted to online. So you've been having story time and rhyme time and reading groups, all now via Facebook and YouTube and Zoom. So yeah, I'm really pleased that we've been able to contribute to that in this way.
If you are listening to this while libraries are still closed, which is hopefully not for long, but like check out the library's e-library, because I don't know about anybody here, but I have decimated the like e-collection of the library, and just wouldn't have needed to until I was forced to. And yeah, I'm like, oh, it's fabulous. You can join, you can read magazines, you can, you know, get your audiobooks. It's that whole thing of people just don't think about the library in the way that it doesn't get a lot of screen time, you know. Actually, when you take time to look at what it's doing, it's just invaluable to so many different people on so many scales. And some of them are those really dramatic moments of, people that are in really dire circumstances and don't have access to public funds, or just are really in need in that particular moment, and that this is a door that's open. Or just those tiny little moments of just like of pleasure and making life beautiful and interesting and rich. And yeah, I was already a bookworm, but I'm fully a library convert after it all.
Invaluable, radical and free.
Sorry? Invaluable and free, yeah.
Invaluable, radical and free, I said.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, amazing. Shelley, you wanted to come in there?
Oh, I was just thinking about the ebook thing, because I am one of these people that loses cards of every kind. So my library card, we had the lockdown, I'm like, oh, I can't access the library because I don't know what my number is, because my card is no one knows. But you can just join online as well. So it's completely accessible wherever, whatever, if you can start with nothing and still access everything.
Yeah, because you have to go in to kind of confirm that you are you, but I think lots of places have changed that now.
Yeah, it was really easy to just get in, yeah.
As Sue Williamson said in her interview, you can get a library card as soon as you're born, and you can be buried with your library card if you want to.
Nice.
My goodness. Well, if it's all right to move towards summing up then, and then I'll invite the three of you to add anything more you want to add. But I've learned so much from hearing about these two projects, the different kinds of energies and results that they've driven and produced. And I'm really interested in that. And I love this idea that thinking about very past memories of reading, as opposed to thinking about libraries now, institutions now have been producing different kinds of oral histories. I'm really struck by that idea of how we almost infantilize libraries and studying by associating them with childhood and early youth only, and how important it is to think instead about lifelong learning. And we do live in a culture which radically undervalues studying and learning and immersing yourself in what things like libraries have to offer. Laura said that libraries don't get enough screen time, so I'm pleased to think that your project and our project have changed that a little bit. Shelley talked about them being completely accessible, and Sarah about them being invaluable, radical and free, which is great. And my final thought is that I feel like the French language is doing better than the English language on this, because the word bibliothèque just sounds so much like the word discotheque, and I think that we should embrace libraries as discos. I'm old enough and tragic enough to think of discos as the coolest thing on earth. Yeah, discoing libraries I think would be nice.
They actually do. So not right now, obviously, but yeah, Toronto Library were running like Rave in the Stacks, visual stuff, and yeah. I want that in my library for sure.
Is there anything anyone would like to add before we wrap up, other than a dance? We can do a dance.
I think it's really interesting. One of the interviewees, I can't remember, Sarah, was talking about how it was no coincidence that libraries, public libraries, first started around at the idea of universal franchise, and just there is something about that appreciation of learning, and like what I think there's a bigger conversation for what culture is and what the value of culture is in society, and what education is, and whether that is formal education or not, and just the place, like how valuable perhaps it is to just be like, we are here for everybody of every class and socioeconomic status, and that learning is worth it, like it has inherent value, as opposed to you are more employable or you will earn more money. I think there's a really interesting thing to think about when there are conversations about libraries being had.
Shelley, Sarah, anything you want to add?
I don't think so. I think that's things up nicely.
Yeah.
I mean,
I could probably talk, on and on and on about libraries.
Well, let's have you back for another film sometime. I think that's probably the best way to do it. And just listening to you speaking with my kind of boring historian hat on, I think about the fact that books in the 16th century are not things you read silently on your own. but that you read aloud communally. And I wonder if that's one of the shifts in between your two projects, that libraries undo some of the negative things about books, that we now think of books as private. I mean, in lots of ways, it's a good thing. It's wonderful people have private space. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but books themselves were sort of libraries a couple of centuries ago. There was a real shift from books as a public thing that you all gather around at, to books as being something that you hide away from the rest of the world with. And it's really great to hear about libraries providing that sense of community. I've learned so much, and I'm really thrilled to hear about this work, and I'm excited to think about people looking at the websites as a result of this film. So thank you very much, all three of you.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks, everyone.
It was fun.
Cheers.